Turns out that our cancer map didn't look anything like that. This is 1970 to 1994. So within my lifetime here, we have seen a complete reversal of the cancer map. And so here, 1970 to 1994, I've broken them into the different cancer types, but you can see that they all have predominances up here in the northeast and then in the northwest. This is colon cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer. And so we can look at these different cancers and see this huge predominance in the northeast or the northwest. And so that's been the map. And so we used to think that voting Democrat caused cancer. But then this happened, and suddenly just in a short 15-year period, we reversed the map. Now keep in mind, cancer's gone up around the whole world, right? And including every state in this country has gone up in their cancer rates. But something's gotten in here to cause a logarithmic rate of increase in cancer, to where it used to be the lowest area of cancer in the whole country, and now it's the highest. And we did that in 15 years, which should be absolutely impossible knowing the pathophysiology of cancer. We did something to the global environment of the United States that would change in a heterogeneous population genetically, right? We have Asians, we've got Mexicans, we've got the black community down here in the South. We have a very heterogeneous population here, and yet they all did that. And so something happened geologically or geographically that really changed our cancer epidemic. And it doesn't seem to be coming from the physicians. We didn't change our behavior. We have been prescribing the same amount of antibiotics year on year for the last 20 years. And so that's looking at the stable rate of antibiotic prescription, which again is about 830 prescriptions for every 1,000 people. But we've been doing that kind of damage for a good while. So we don't seem to be responsible for whatever happened here when it comes to the microbiome. This is the antibiotic that I think caused everything to happen. This is a molecule you may not have heard of yet, but you use it every single day, either directly or indirectly. It's called glyphosate. And glyphosate is a very close cousin to Agent Orange. It's called an organophosphate. Agent Orange was made by a small company you've never heard of called Monsanto, and they used it for warfare, right? In the Vietnam, what were we using it for? Killing the trees, to defoliate the jungles, right? So we could see the Viet Cong shoot them with small caliber weapons to try to disable them so they'd have to all take care of their damaged people. Turns out the war got over in the mid-1970s, and suddenly there was not a demand for all this chemical they'd been making, and they knew that it caused cancer, so they needed something a little less toxic. And so they looked for an organophosphate of the same family that was less toxic, and this one had happened to be patented back in the 1950s, 1959, by a Japanese researcher who made the chemical and patented it. And they started buying it up, thinking that we're going to find some use for this chemical. And when they first did it, they thought it was going to be really brilliant for cleaning pipes. You know, calcified deposits within sewage drainage and things like this they could be basically a biochemical roto-rooter and clean deposits out. So they started using it for this, and then they found out that whatever was on the end of that pipe died. And so we killed all of the green stuff that was coming out the end of the pipe, and they said, well, that's too bad, we just killed a bunch of that, but there's a market for that. We could kill plants, and we could do it with the farmers. And so in 1974, they patented it as a weed killer, you would think, but they didn't. It actually got never patented as a weed killer. It did get put in as the active ingredient to Roundup. Roundup became the most successful single weed killer on earth, and it's what you guys use every day in your community. If you're not spraying it on your gardens, I guarantee your community is spraying it on your roadsides, in your parks, all over the place. And that chemical now is the biggest kind of single chemical worldwide sprayed, and that chemical has never been patented as a weed killer. It's been patented as an antibiotic. Interesting. And so now we've got a chemical that we're spraying worldwide to kill weeds, and yet it's actually an antibiotic, and so we're killing the microbiome of the soil we spray that on, which means we're going to start to grow plants that are deficient in nutrients, because the microbiome for a plant, just like in the human, is what feeds us. So we're going to start growing plants in soil that do not have the food and supplements that are needed to grow a healthy immune system and a healthy body, and so those plants are going to suffer. And when they suffer, their immune system goes down, they're going to have pest problems and they're going to have invasive weed problems. Well, the chemical company is super happy about that because they can sell you pesticides and herbicides, and so it develops a very nice codependent relationship with the chemical industry. And this is not just happening on the gardener level, this is happening at our large-scale agricultural level by the 1990s. And so we start spraying this chemical. The chemical is interesting because we've been told by all the chemical companies that it's safer than water, which is always hilarious when somebody makes a comment like that. But it's safer than water because we don't have the target of the chemical. What it's targeting is an enzyme pathway that humans don't have. And that sounds reassuring. Well, at least it can't get inside our body and block some enzyme pathway that would kill us. Well, then what does that enzyme pathway do? It turns out that that glyphosate blocks the shikimate enzyme pathway that's only in bacteria, fungi, and plants, but not in humans. And in plants, fungi, and bacteria, what we never really asked is, well, what the heck is that enzyme doing? And it turns out what those enzymes are doing is making the aromatic amino acids. These are the building blocks for life. There's only 26 building blocks for proteins. This is very similar to the English alphabet, where there's 26 dominant amino acids that will build the vast majority of your protein structure. And so the amino acids are being built, and there's about 8 or 9 of these that are called essential amino acids. And so these are kind of like the vowels of our English alphabet. If you start subtracting vowels, you start misspelling lots and lots of words, in this case proteins, and you start building a weakened body. It turns out that the building blocks they're deleting include tyrosine, tryptophan, and 5-HTP. Those are the building blocks for our neurotransmitters. If we were to delete out the neurotransmitter building blocks, we would expect our children to have a very difficult time with sensory processing and neural processing because they're deficient in the fuel for those neurons, because they literally can't get the building blocks from the food that they're eating because it was grown in an environment that was steeped in Roundup or glyphosate. And so we are subtracting out the building blocks, the essential building blocks that we can't make in our own bodies by using glyphosate on the food that we consume. And so those are, again, a list of those, some of those essential amino acids that are made in that environment. And now if we look now at glyphosate and say, well, is there a correlation between glyphosate and maybe the rate of cancer? And so I pulled these maps, and I was very disappointed to find out that there was maybe a little bit of correlation in that I was all in the Midwest here that we were spraying it. And then there's a big strip all the way up through here where we are in New York and Vermont and all of that. So we've got a fair amount of glyphosate being sprayed along the East Coast, and then a huge dominant patch in the Midwest, but it didn't correlate perfectly with our cancer rates until you find out one extraordinary fact is that that toxin is water soluble. You're not going to be able to see it real well from where you are right now, but this is the United States in white outline here. And in red, this massive thing that takes up some 85% of the United States that then turns into this tornado-looking structure right here and then ends right down in a little strip there is the Mississippi River. This is the tributary system of the entire Mississippi, and it picks up some 85 to 90% of the glyphosate sprayed in the United States. And it's a water-soluble toxin that will be concentrated throughout that water system. And it turns out that the last 90 miles of the Mississippi runs between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. Guess where the highest rates of cancer in the entire developed world are? Baton Rouge to New Orleans. We call it Cancer Alley. Highest rates of cancer in the entire world. We have put one chemical into the system that is water soluble that kills bacteria massively. It's become the biggest antibiotic in the world, and it's now being sprayed at an extraordinary volume. And it's being sprayed in your backyards, it's being sprayed on your driveways, it's being sprayed in your roadways, it's being sprayed on your food because we developed genetically modified Roundup-ready crops. So why is GMO bad? Now you know a short answer to that. There's many things wrong with it. But the short answer to why is GMO bad? Because it allows our food to be steeped in a chemical that is an antibiotic that's going to kill the bacteria and fungi in the soil, and it's going to kill the bacteria and the fungi in the stomach of your children, the intestines of your children. You as an adult are going to get sterile eating an antibiotic in the form of glyphosate, which is again water soluble. 70% of our world is water. The earth is 70% water. Our bodies are 70% water. The entire life on planet is 70% water, and we put a chemical into that that is water soluble and gets everywhere. Recent studies have shown that 70% to 75% of the rainfall samples taken in this Cancer Alley kind of area is contaminated with glyphosate, the rainfall. 75% of the air they breathe is contaminated with Roundup. And it turns out that's the same case with California through our agricultural environment there, and much of the East Coast, including where we are today. We're breathing an antibiotic. It's raining on us, it's raining on our fish, it's raining on our birds that are out in the wetlands. We are being steeped in an antibiotic. The United States actually is using a little less of this than other countries, but let's now correlate this with a couple other diseases. This is mental illness, and you'll start to see that historically it was the Midwest that had seasonal affective disorder and really high rates of depression. And if you gave them sunshine, the depression would improve. Suddenly our sun belt is caught up and in some states is beating the Northwest for the amount of major depression and anxiety disorders. Again, a pretty good state-by-state correlation with the amount of Roundup there. Infectious diseases. You guys are very famous in this neck of the woods for Lyme disease. It turns out that Lyme is only one of the many bacteria and odd microbiome that live in ticks. And we used to think that that was what was causing all of our Lyme disease. But it turns out that if you take a look at our highest Lyme disease rates, they follow our glyphosate spraying map really carefully. Until we killed the microbiome, Lyme wasn't a dominant piece of anything. We had to screw up the balance of the ecosystem with a broad spectrum antibiotic before Lyme or any other pathogen could come to be. Did any of you in elementary or school or high school hear of somebody who had a candida problem? No. Not until 1990s did we all suddenly all have a candida issue, and everybody got candida in their gut and candida in their bladder and candida here and candida on their skin, and all the babies have candida now, and it's all over because we made them sterile bacteria with a widespread antibiotic. Has anybody heard of gluten sensitivity? Did anybody hear of gluten sensitivity before 1992? And the answer is we really didn't. Glyphosate usage worldwide. In 2015, over 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate was sprayed worldwide. That's 4.5 billion pounds of single chemical antibiotic. We are slaughtering the microecosystem of the planet with a single chemical. And we have an opportunity to change that. And you have an opportunity to do that locally before we tackle the world. My companies are starting to tackle the big agricultural environment, but we can't do the microenvironment as well. It's actually going to be harder for us to change your community than it is for us to change big ag. And so I travel all over the place asking you guys to get in touch with your community leaders. And you have an amazing one here with Edwina and this whole Perfect Earth mission here. Somebody got a bee in her bonnet to save the world. And she knew that a part of that was to change the chemical spraying in the yards and the parks and everything else in her environment. And she's asking you to join her. Some of you have. Some of you maybe have an opportunity to join her now bigger. If you guys don't change your local environment, there will not be children here in 30 years. It's that upon us. We have a decision to make. Are we going to change everything, and are we going to do it locally? And then the whole world will change because everybody can do it locally. All right. Another look at glyphosate and its direct effect on the human body, because so far I've told you that it destroys the microbiome, and the chemical companies have been arguing that this doesn't hurt human bodies directly. Of course, the World Health Organization finally came out and said, yeah, this is probably a carcinogen. Now California's made a big push to get it included on the Prop 65 and all of that to get it listed as a carcinogen. I'm a former cancer researcher. In my laboratory, we have over 60 years of cancer research expertise in the lab, and all of us know what cancer cells look like under a microscope, and I can tell you that it happens very quickly when you expose human cells to glyphosate. And I'm going to show you kind of that mission here, or what happens. It begins in the gastrointestinal tract. So your gastrointestinal tract is your biggest exposure to the outside world. The outside world is kept away from your immune system by a single cell layer. And so this kind of like coral reef structure here is the small intestine. And these big coral reef projections here, these finger-like things, are lined by a single little tiny line of cells that are called epithelial cells. And those epithelial cells are the barrier between the outside world, everything you put in your mouth, all the chemicals, all the food, all the water, and your immune system that sits right behind it, which is the GALT, the gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue. Some 60-70% of your entire immune system, your whole body, lies right behind that barrier as the front line of defense between you and the outside world. It's a big surface area. It covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. It's your largest exposure. And yet it's only 1 cell layer deep. That's half the thickness of a human hair. Picture a piece of cellophane across 2 tennis courts that's half the width of a human hair. That's what protects you and your children from the chemicals that you have in your environment. 1 cell layer thick. That seems like really poor engineering. We should have like 30 cells there. Let's build up our front wall of defense. Why would we have 1 cell layer? This is the story of checks and balances biologically. Something planned for our worst mistakes. If this species starts to really muck it up and put chemicals everywhere and destroy the microbiome, they're going to suffer very quickly. They're going to be a very sensitive species. And we are very sensitive. And we are killing ourselves right now. And we're killing our children, we're killing ourselves, because we are 1 cell away from the outside world. And if we lose that barrier, we lose our sense of self-identity. That barrier system is made of trillions of tiny little cells that are all glued together. And then by gluing them together, we need a protein structure again. And the protein that does that is something called a tight junction. They're depicted here as these little staples that kind of staple a few cells together. And if we break those cells, now everything from the outside world can go right into your immune system unregulated. This is what we call leaky gut. Leaky brain is the same phenomenon. And so we can break any tissue barrier, whether it's this or the vascular system, endothelium of all of our blood vessels is also tied together with the same Velcro-like protein structures, the tight junctions, and so is the blood-brain barrier. And so your brain is only protected from what's in your bloodstream based on the integrity of those tight junctions or Velcro proteins. Unfortunately, your kidney tubules are also tied together with the same protein structure. And so if we were to develop a chemical that could damage tight junctions directly, we would turn the entire population into a leaky sieve on the front end. We would start to leak toxin and organic material into the body that shouldn't be there. We would have to start mounting an immune response to our whole environment. And as we lose our self-identity at the cell level, we might start attacking ourselves with something called an autoimmune disease, which is our immune system attacking ourselves as if we were foreign material. Currently today, 1 in 4 girls by the age of 12 is attacking her thyroid with her own immune system, 1 in 4. Amazing rate of confusion as to what's the outside world because we're breaking the front. Then we would break the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier and we would start to leak and we'd see a lot of neurologic inflammation and overwhelm and we'd see a lot of disorder in our children. By the time they were in their teens, they would be in major depression and anxiety disorder. And we would see a huge amount of dementia syndromes in our adults and we would start to see neurologic degenerative conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all of that by the time we were mid-age. And then the kidney tubules would fall apart and we'd be unable to detox our bodies through the kidney pathways and we would turn into sponges for toxin, which is precisely what's happened to our entire population. So this is, I hope you can see this from where you sit, this is really the heart of what we've done in our laboratory over the last 7 years. We've really studied extensively that barrier system of the tight junctions and the relationship to Roundup or glyphosate. So this is a small intestine that's now grown in our labs. And what we've done is we've done something really cool. Science is really cool, and sometimes I have to dork out just for a minute. What we do here is we develop an antibody to tight junctions by exposing that protein of the tight junction to a rabbit, and the rabbit reacts to that and builds an antibody against it. Then we purify that antibody, we take that, and we tag it with a glow-in-the-dark jellyfish protein. That's really cool stuff. All right, so that was the dork out part. Jellyfish protein glowing on an antibody that tags a single protein to show you where the tight junctions or Velcro are, and you can see that these cells are all Velcroed together to create a solid sheet or a barrier system between your immune system and the outside world. At 20 parts per million of glyphosate, which is about what you would see in a conventionally grown potato or beet or any root vegetable that I would recommend to my patients, 16 minutes later the whole system has fallen apart. With one chemical, we sterilize the planet, therefore losing the whole basis of life, which is micronutrient delivery and the intelligence of the incredible genomic information of the microbe or life that's going to build you a body today, is now missing. We deleted out the essential amino acids that were important for building everything from our neurotransmitters to our sex hormones and our reproductive capacity. We then, with the same chemical, added a destructive nature to the very front line of defense, and we opened up a leaky sieve across the membranes. One chemical so far. This is 1990. We were growing wheat in this country as a major staple crop and had been for hundreds of years. In 1992, we came up with a very clever decision. Monsanto came along and said, we're really not selling enough of this weed killer. What could we spray it on? Maybe we could start spraying our food. Well, of course, the farmer's like, you can't kill my crops. That's my lifeline. But then Monsanto's like, no, there's one crop you have to kill before you can eat it. What's that one? Wheat. Wheat has to be dead and dry before you can harvest it. So in 1992, they came up with a clever program where they stopped selling weed killer to the farmer there. Well, actually, they were happy to sell that, but they came up with a new product line and said, this is not a weed killer, this is a desiccant, a drying agent. And so they said, just spray this on your wheat fill and it will dry it prematurely and you'll be able to harvest early. And if you're a northern farmer that has your crop at risk by the end of the growing season, and if it snows early, you just lost your entire crop, boy, don't worry. You've got a storm coming. Just spray your whole crop with Roundup. It will be killed immediately. And in 2 or 3 days, you can harvest the whole thing instead of waiting for the paint to dry. And that's literally how they act. Well, you're just waiting around, waiting for the wheat to die. Well, what would happen if a grass or a wheat would grow up and build a seed pod, and that seed pod would slowly turn into a dry head of wheat that would then, in its time, be picked and delivered to the customer in the form of ground wheat, versus a premature death to that seed head? Would the protein structure in there look the same? Would the carbohydrate or the fibers look the same? No, nothing looks the same in prematurely killed wheat. So in 1992, we started killing wheat prematurely and putting it right into the food chain. And interestingly, by 1994, we had a big spike in an autoimmune condition, an immune system where we were starting to attack our own body, and that immune system was triggered by wheat. It was called gluten sensitivity initially, and then became celiac disease. And now we have gluten sensitivity, which is non-antibody based, and we have celiac disease, which is the autoantibody disease process that destroys our gut lining as an autoimmune disease triggered by wheat. The black line here is the number of acres sprayed with Roundup year to year since 1993. And the yellow bar is the rates of celiac disease in our country. And you see a huge correlation between the number of acres sprayed, i.e. the amount of wheat entering our food chain with glyphosate residues on it and wheat that's prematurely killed, and our reaction to that wheat that would then cross-react with our own body and destroy our gut lining and turn us into celiac patients. And so we have this huge disease being triggered by this one chemical. This is going to be hard to see perhaps with the light that we have flowing in here, which is wonderful. I love the sunshine coming in. But quickly, this is again the glow-in-the-dark jellyfish protein on ZO1, and it's gluing together all these cells that are now glued together. You can't see the cytoplasm. These are the nucleus within the cells. The cytoplasm is black, but they're glued together. Now the cytoplasm has fallen apart, and you've got these train tracks where you have 2 green lines between the nucleus instead of just one, and you've blown those apart, and you have leaky gut from the gliadin, which is a protein within the gluten that's present in one slice of pizza. So now one slice of pizza can suddenly blow apart your gut lining and cause a huge inflammatory reaction. Why? Because we've changed the lining of this gut, and the way in which we did that was exposing that gut to glyphosate. And so if you take a control intestinal membrane and you expose it to gluten, you get a little bit of a dip. You'll do a little bit of injury, but the body can usually deal with that. But if you add glyphosate in a tiny amount that you would come on that wheat, you suddenly get an 80% drop in the protective quality of your gut and your leaky sieve, and now you're reacting to the wheat and everything else in your environment. You suddenly have food allergies, food sensitivities, you've got environmental sensitivities, you've got all this stuff happening because we just opened up the leaky sieve with the same molecule that sterilized your environment and took away the building blocks for human life. All right, so our group has now teased out exactly the mechanism by which this is happening, and we're trying to get this published. Not surprisingly, the first 2 journals we've sent this to haven't wanted to publish this one. But we did publish that data that we just saw on that previous slide, showing that glyphosate is synergistically damaging to the gut lining. That one got published. This one shows exactly how it does it, so this is the smoking gun, and this one's proving a little tougher to get somebody to publish for us. But glyphosate exposure upregulates the receptor by which gliadin will cause the leaky gut. And so we've been able to show that now, and we're trying to bring that one to be. So gliadin binds CXCR3 receptors to trigger zonulin production. Zonulin occludins toxin pathway is what opens up the tight junction to cause not just leaky gut, but also leaky vasculature and a leaky blood-brain barrier. And it's telling that the main symptoms of gluten sensitivity are not bowel related. It's not bloating and it's not irritable bowel, it's not those things. Those can be present, but the number one complaint of gluten sensitive patients is brain fog, neurologic. Number 2 is sleep disorder. Number 3 is depression symptoms. Number 4 is gastric upset, GI symptoms. So the top 3 conditions are actually the brain barrier falling apart, not the gut barrier falling apart. We're turning ourselves into leaky sieves by the co-induction of glyphosate and gluten along not just the gut barrier, but the blood-brain barrier pathways. Then it gets really trippy, and I'm going to just show one slide because I love looking at the miracle of life. 2 cells are glued together here, one on top, one at the bottom, and there's a whole this is now showing under an electron microscope what looks like a spot weld. And there's just some sort of dense protein structure that's tying those 2 cells together in this little band. And that is a very, very tiny spot. That's about a tenth, this whole radius here, diameter of this structure, that diameter is about a tenth of a human hair. And so just tiny, tiny little structure. And if we blow that structure up in a cross-section, we find out it's not one structure, but it's hundreds of thousands of tiny little fibers that look like a cable running between one cell and the next. If we go to a higher electron microscope look, it turns out they're tubes, they're hollow. Each of these tiny little structures here is a hollow tube that's beautifully built in construction. Now we're at a thousandth of the width of a human hair, and you've got these perfect tubes. And then even more extraordinary, at the end of every single tube looks like a flower, but when you blow up that flower shape, it turns out that it is an aperture, just like on the end of a camera lens, letting light energy to and fro. It turns out this spot weld is something called a gap junction that runs between one cell and the next to transfer light energy. You are not a biologic creature, you are actually an atomic physics creature. You're not made of the material of cells, you're made of the material of atoms. And atomically, you are extraordinary. I mentioned the mitochondria earlier. The mitochondria are these little things that look like bacteria that live inside your cells and they make all of your energy. Turns out that 1 cubic centimeter of mitochondria makes 10,000 times more energy than 1 cubic centimeter of the surface of the sun. You are 10,000 times more powerful than the surface of the sun in energy production at your mitochondrial level, and all of that is in the form of electrons, electricity. And the electricity in the form of light and energy is being passed from one cell to the next through this exquisite system of fiber optic cables that are regulated very carefully with what information is traveling between your cells. And this incredible system is laced apart as soon as you show glyphosate to the cells. What is cancer ultimately? Cancer, as it turns out, is a cell that has forgotten it's part of a larger organism. It has become so isolated. All of the proteins that were connected to its environment and cellular structures around it have become lysed, and that cell has become lonely and does not know that there's life outside of it, and all it knows is it's a very damaged cell. The average human cell has 20,000 unrepaired injuries at the genetic level. That's pretty amazing since we only have 20,000 genes. There are a lot of screwed up base pairs in a cancer cell. So that damaged, unrepairable cell thinks it's the only thing left at life, and so the only option it's got is to procreate. So it just starts replicating itself over and over again, saying, I've got to hold on because I am so short-lived. Cancer cells die constantly, so they have to replicate faster than they're dying. We are literally looking at a $500 billion a year in chemotherapy in this country right now. $500 billion in the cancer industry being dumped into the loneliest cells in our body. And we just poison them more, we poison them more, we poison them more, thinking we've got a public health effort to kill cancer. It's the opposite of what our cancer cells need. And so when a cancer patient ends up in my room, the first thing I teach them how to do is love their cancer. It's the most important thing is to realize that cancer is you. It's from you, and it needs to find out it's from you. And so you need to start screaming your name and identity back into that cell. And we're going to give you a lot of supplements and other things for the microbiome to get your fiber optic cables to reattach and get that information transferred. But you need to know that you are real, and you hold your space, and you are 70 trillion cells that are glued together in great purpose to carry out some soul mission that is maybe yet to be defined, and you showed up right now. And so we have this awesome story that unfolds in cancer in my clinic, is that it is the greatest moment in my patients' lives to find themselves. Whether they go on to die from that condition or they go on to survive and beat that condition, they find themselves in the journey, and that's worth the journey right there. And so before you get cancer, find yourself. Scream at yourself in the mirror in the morning, I am who? Who are you? Scream your name, and then listen. Listen for what you're here to do. Because you showed up right now, we have to change everything in the next 17 years if we're going to survive together. And we can change it all together, and there's heroes among you that you can join. This is a quick snapshot across the course of life from age birth to age 78, the average life expectancy in the United States of all the kind of the cascade of diseases that we expect to happen. It starts with colic and goes to sensory processing deficits and ends with vascular disease, cancer, and dementia. And so there's this very predictable pattern of this inflammatory cascade through life. We rank 49th in the world for health outcomes in this country. Croatia, Peru, all of these countries rank well ahead of us. War-torn countries with almost no infrastructure are having better health outcomes than the United States of America. 49th in the world for health outcomes. We're number one in one category though. Number one for neonatal death on day one in the developed world. More children will die on day one of life in the United States than any other developed country in the world. That number hit in 2012, which maybe coincidentally was the year that we started to mandate the hepatitis B sexually transmitted disease vaccine on day one. Well, if we have all that disease, haven't you ever heard that thy food is thy medicine? Dates back to Hippocrates, who got all the credit. Of course, the Chinese medicine doctors were saying that 2,000 years before him. So for at least 4,000 years, humans have recognized that the food is in the medicine. And if we're that diseased, 49th in the world, 46% of our children with a chronic disease, well, we should just feed them food, because the food should be their medicine. Well, it turns out that the same shikimate pathway that's blocked by glyphosate is where we get the alkaloids. And the alkaloids are the medicine within our food. The alkaloids are the antiparasites. If we took out the quinine compounds within our food chain, within all of the beautiful fruits and vegetables, if we took out all these compounds, we would expect to see a lot of unregulated parasite conditions. Something like Lyme disease would become epidemic in the community. If we were to take out the anti-asthma compounds of ephedrine and things like this that are naturally occurring in the food, we would see a ton of asthma in our children and adults. If we were to take out the Homo Harrington category of all of our colored fruits and vegetables, we would expect to see a ton of cancer in the environment. If we were to take out the galantamine from our nutritional base, we would see a ton of sensory processing neurologic conditions because of the lack of the cholinomimetics. We'd have autonomic nervous system dysfunction. We would see a ton of hypertension because vincomine would be removed. We would see a whole bunch of antiarrhythmic cardiac death because we lost quinidine and its family. We'd have a ton of chronic pain in the world if we eliminated the alkaloids from our food chain, because the analgesics in our food look a lot like morphine, and our food forever treated that pain. But if we were to spray all of our food with something like glyphosate that would block that, we would see a lot of chronic pain. We would see a ton of diabetes because it turns out that piperine is really rich in a lot of our foods and now has none because we grow it in a glyphosate-rich soil, and we've lost that and we have diabetes. And so it turns out that not only have we created a sterile world without bacteria, a world in which we are destroyed in our own self-identity as humans by the destruction of tight junctions that now allow the whole world to enter. Our immune system is overwhelmed and our kidneys can't clear it and our brains are being steeped in all the subsequent toxins. And so we get disease, and we can't treat the disease with our food because the same chemical took the pharmaceuticals right out of our food. Well, it's perhaps not a coincidence that that company, Monsanto, has been owned by pharmaceutical companies for the last 30 years, because that's a pretty good idea. If you're a pharmacy, it would be smart to own the company that's removing the pharmaceuticals from the food chain in the first place. So every seed of genetically modified ground-up drenched food that you've planted would then guarantee that that individual was going to build a human body that was deficient, and it would become diseased, and it would have no pharmaceutical in the food. So as a cancer researcher, I worked a lot with vincristine. Vincristine is one of the most common antibiotics on the planet. The way that we make vincristine is very simple. We let the algae do it for us. It's not some fancy chemical. It's just in our food. Vincristine is one of the most common alkaloids in our food, but it's depleted in all of the food crops, and so now we turn to algae to grow our vincristine for us. And so we make these algae beds in these protected greenhouses, and we grow vincristine and purify it out, and we sell it for $28,000 a gram. It's some 6 times more expensive than gold now. It's a naturally occurring compound that should have been in your food chain and always was up until the late 1980s, 90s. And so we have destroyed the medicinal features of our food with one chemical. So this is the legacy of glyphosate on the planet right now. And again, the main places this is sprayed is actually certainly in the agricultural environment, but the second place is in the horticultural environment, in the yards that you guys take care of. And so we are decimating the world through these following ways. And so we'll have those integrated in. This video is going to eventually be on the website, and so you guys can go back and note this if you didn't have the chance to take notes on these efforts and you need that information.